Welcome. Today's post is Globalism Banking, Gold for Sachs. Published on July 31, 2023. I've laid a lot of groundwork over many years in order to be able to chart out the bigger picture of how the world came to be what it is. And although banking may seem boring, it's actually the perfect topic for a post. Here are the topics we'll be decoding today. You can always find this list in the description below. If you enjoy this video, please press the like button, and subscribe for weekly full-length blog posts, and shorter, more shareable videos. Let's begin. You may be predisposed to think banking is boring. Please stick with me because there may not be any subject more important to decode than this one. Banking is the root of everything that goes on everywhere. By definition, it is, because how else does anything get funded? This will be apparent right away because the first thing to go over is Rothschild banking choices. About 6 minutes in, there's an interesting line in this video. Goldman Sachs makes note of the UK royal advisor Rothschild and how this job helped Goldman Sachs go global. No subtitles, so I had to transcribe it. They triggered a revolution in global finance. The head of Goldman Sachs was the economic force behind FDR. FDR equals Federal Reserve. I've decoded him as a symbol for the Federal Reserve. So for Goldman Sachs to be chosen for international finance, it reinforces the connection. FDR's economy guru, Weinberg, Mr. Wall Street. The documentary tells his story as going from rags to riches, literally cleaning toilets and spittoons. They specifically call out cleaning spittoons in the documentary, and then transitioning into the most famous banker in the world. More famous than Goldman Sachs itself according to their own documentary. It's absurd, but there is a purpose to the story. Remember, this was during the Great Depression. A rags to riches story for the economy guy is a perfect fit. A way to get the public behind the economic changes. This guy right here, just like you, he was at the bottom, and so he knows what you are going through and will help you. So follow FDR, who was smart enough to pick this kind of guy. The documentary asserted that most of Goldman Sachs' business came from Weinberg alone. That every company he did business with flourished while everything else died. Hillary Clinton was paid $675K by Goldman Sachs for 3 speeches. Rothschild had his honeymoon in Bill Clinton's White House. That Goldman Sachs documentary also asserted that only Morgan's bank did comparable business during much of the last century. Biggest banks, Morgan, Rothschild, and Sachs. J.P. Morgan being both the Titanic owner and the founder of the world's biggest bank. You may ask, why don't we see Rothschild on any of these top bank lists? You can see J.P. Morgan and Rothschild work together. The history in even mainstream media articles is that for centuries they were the biggest bank. The history in even mainstream media articles is that for centuries they were the biggest bank. Financing the wars against Napoleon and Suez Canal. Described as being as big then as today if the biggest banks plus international money organizations merged. Here's a mainstream media article specifically calling out conspiracy theories about Rothschild. They compare it to be as if Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos combined wealth. It gives the origin as 1700s Rothschild patriarch dispatched his 5 sons to set up an international network of banks. Reconcile. February 2, 2017. Trump nominates Jay Powell to second most important job in country, head of the Federal Reserve. February 2, 2018. Dow plummets 666. 6th largest ever. February 5, 2018. Jay Powell assumes position. February 5, 2018. Question stock market dive, 666, signal to POTUS they control markets. Sex and Golden Sax. That story about 5 sons setting up a system of international banks is echoed in a movie about the Rothschild family. Movie ends with Rothschild becoming richest in the world after beating Napoleon. It was the most successful movie of newly launched 20th Century Pictures. April 7, 1934. House of Rothschild 20th Century Pictures. April 19, 1934. Fox releases Stand Up and Cheer. The movie that made child actress Shirley Temple a star. May 31, 1935. Fox plus 20th Century Pictures merge into 20th Century Fox. Note the plot. Due to bankers getting rich from the Great Depression, POTUS, FDR at the time, sends girl entertainers in red around country to raise spirits. Shirley Temple as Cupid capturing hearts. The first ultra-famous child actress. Define Temple. It was 1934 and FDR had just been inaugurated 1933 through Goldman Sachs as the largest backer. A movie about the new POTUS sending women in red for entertainment, and it becomes the big break for the first big child star in Shirley Temple. I cover Shirley Temple a bit in this one, but there's a lot more I could dig up. I've laid a lot of groundwork over many years now to chart out the bigger picture, and this is the perfect topic to do it with. I have many posts that decode left-wing media, but now it's time to take a serious look at right-wing media. How did it come to exist? How has it not collapsed given the domination of the left? January 20, 1993, Clinton inauguration. January 25, 1993, Goldman Sachs co-chairman Robert Rubin assistant to President Economic Policy. January 11, 1995, Goldman Sachs Secretary of the Treasury. Sachs is golden. Gold plus man plus Sachs equals Sachs playing. Phonetic comms are common, so this is a plausible symbol of his backing. It is noted frequently as groundbreaking or sometimes called the moment Clinton won the election. It is noted frequently as groundbreaking or sometimes called the moment Clinton won the election. Important symbol. The sax playing was prevalent in 90s culture. The song played was Elvis' Heartbreak Hotel, lyrics about being lonely in a hotel and wanting a woman. To truly understand we have to broaden our scope. The other big banks. PNC Bank caught my eye as holding a lot of firsts. The first bank to fund a USA mortgage and also being the first bank to apply for a national charter. A national system of banks. What's particularly interesting about this is the founding date. 1845 summer equals PNC Bank founded. 1845 summer equals origin of Diamond baseball fields. The origin being father of baseball, Cartwright Union Bank employee and head of baseball, Gotham Club. Union plus bank. This likely gives us the root of baseball comms. I'd already decoded them as tied to big business changes, and so it makes sense it would all have a root of banks. June 10, 1880. Bad pitching by Porman, first to allow 2 home runs by the same batter in the same inning. June 12, 1880. Richmond first perfect pitched game ever in baseball. June 17, 1880. Montgomery Ward's second perfect game beating Porman team. This helps us understand the environment Goldman Sachs and others entered into. That original, perfect, baseball comm was about Montgomery Ward and the new revolutionary system of selling retail products nationally. Their only competition then was Sears. Why do I bring this up? IPO. Goldman Sachs took Sears public. In fact, they pioneered taking companies public. Inventing the entire metric to do so with retail. This was their second IPO. Often erroneously asserted as their first online because of how famous an event it was. They also took Ford public. In more modern times they took Microsoft public March 13, 1986. Just a month before Chernobyl. IPO of the year. This is particularly important in context of globalization when we look at the other big thing Microsoft and Goldman Sachs did in 1986. In 1986 both Microsoft and Goldman Sachs expanded heavily into Japan. Microsoft setting up their Japanese branch that year and Goldman Sachs doing the same. A $500 million landmark investment, big enough it was major news when approved by the Federal Reserve. Goldman Sachs in Japan obtained the first license to establish banking branches there. They were given preferential treatment over local Japanese banks by their own accounts. At the same time, 4 local banks were hit with scandals that drove business to Goldman Sachs Japan. I should be clear, they began in Japan before 1986, that was just a milestone for them. Their first Asia office was Japan in 1974. The documentary linked at the start talked about how big their HQ in China was before seemingly in an afterthought equating it with their Japan HQ. Though in China they talked about how companies have millions of employees that Goldman Sachs was tasked to help manage. This was 2000s. Japan became the second biggest economy right after they opened shop there, and the same thing happened when they set up shop in China. I find it interesting this globalization push was defined by Goldman Sachs as BRICS. Reminds me of Tetris and gold brick house building symbolism. But that is probably coincidence. Given they even obtained preferential treatment in Japan, clearly there must be some big comms tied to that. World Warrior, Globalism. So I looked into their biggest moment tied to Japan to see if there was anything that jumped out as a potential hint on what was going on. February 6, 1991. Goldman Sachs license obtained to establish banking branches in Japan. February 6, 1991. Street Fighter II, the World Warrior revolutionizes fighting games. Remember, Goldman Sachs pioneered globalism with banking in Japan. Same exact day we have a revolutionary game where you travel around the world. Can you think of many other games around that time that had a premise even close to that? I can't think of a single one except for the ones that were inspired by this one. August 11, 1987. Fed Chair start Alan Greenspan until 2006. August 12, 1987. Street Fighter I Arcade. Given the connection between the Fed and Goldman Sachs, I believe this is a positive correlation. But what does it mean? Let's look into the most famous fighting game of all time. There is a reason why things go from popular to revolutionary. Most likely it was time to something important, and to figure out what that was. Iconography on arcade of white man beating black man. Intro has same as crowd watches. February 6, 1991. Street Fighter II. March 3, 1991. Rodney King beaten by 4 white officers on tape. May 1992. LA riots triggered by acquittal Rodney King officers. June 1992. Street Fighter II Home. Those riots helped put Clinton in the White House. And then Clinton puts Goldman Sachs into Treasury head. Why Street Fighter? History. August 1968. Street Fighting Man song released Rolling Stone riot song. August 1968. Political riots erupt DNC 152 police officers injured. Just before Rodney King riots they shipped a revolutionary product that dominates gaming culture for years. It has a name that invokes riots in the street with imagery of a white man beating a black man. I've covered that last point before, but I found more today. The origin of the name ties to DNC riots and the iconography and timing tie into race riots, but what about the main character himself? July 21, 1964. Ryu birthdate. July 21, 1964. Race riots in Singapore begin. Just like Rodney King, this too results in massive political changes. That intro cutscene of a white man beating a black man. I learned today he has an official backstory. The white guy fishes for black base. That cutscene will forever be inexplicable except when reconciled with comms. The game series itself has plot about an evil villain doing psychological and chemical experimentation to create expendable soldiers. Psycho Drive. The main character Ryu is always at war with himself over on whether to embrace murderous intent. I can't be sure of motivations because rarely are big comms outright pro-evil. The story about fighting MK is opposite of what timing suggests, so perhaps these comms were about tracking MK rather than creating. That almost fits the overall Japan timing. In this post I go over how comms were sent about a transition in surveillance ops in 1993. November 17, 2019. First COVID-19 case. November 17, 2019. Hong Kong police siege 1,300 arrests. It fits the newer version of those riots, which I decoded to be a show, with the primary purpose being to map out criminals' networks with newly flipped string pullers. Which is to say they had just flipped through COVID a ton of string pullers, and so they needed them to use those strings to force criminals into a situation where they could be handled by the law. May 24, 2020. Swift, Killing Eve, hit song, Look What You Made Me Do, Eve equals tomorrow. May 25, 2020. George Floyd murder leads to rioting. May 29, 2020. Biden congratulates swift action. May 29, 2020. Swift blasts Trump for Floyd riots. That Capcom decode. I've been trying to get some clarity on intent, whether it's about tracking or creating. December 17, 1986. Iceman serial killer arrested. December 17, 1986. Capcom Mega Man birth date, debut with Iceman as villain. Also that year. May 12, 1986. Time Magazine Chernobyl reactor. May 12, 1986. Top Gun with Iceman with sunglasses. December 17, 1986. Iceman arrested sunglasses. December 17, 1986. Fukushima Nuclear Power Plant 4 goes live. December 17, 1986. U.S. Congress forms Iran Gate Committee. Top Gun 1986 as decoded here was a cooperation between military and media. So it's looking like Capcom was riding that same ship at the time and a part of handling surveillance. I may be too optimistic though, I try to decode positive when possible. Antarctic investigation robot Antarctica is a symbol used to define a secret place. So someone that's hidden. Search snakes, snakes being many people working as one. Searching for the villain. Notice its use against the final villain and every type of enemy that has duplicates. I'm reminded of an anime I was looking into. The main villain last name pronounced hide on as in a symbol of keeping him hidden. A villain with an MK backstory extremely blunt. Getting money for adopting and raising a monster with abuse. Coordinated with a network around the neighborhood, and it even shows how that is accomplished. Plant seed the ideas into the non-comms aware people around the target to hate them. Turning them into a pariah that will break down and can be remolded into a weapon. Even phrases it as conditioning for how the villain was molded to attack others by subjecting them to torture as a child. I recognize the comms, and for the most part it falls into the One Piece camp of manga/anime in terms of messaging. Power to turn trash into trees, a symbol of taking human refuse, MK, and trying to turn them into friendlies. In both series the main character has a backstory of being on the path to becoming a delinquent, or at the very least making the dumbest possible decisions, but then they are given a positive role model with whom they emulate obsessively. This is done by introducing philosophical concepts in circumstances familiar to those abused, but that's a much longer subject. You can read about that here if you like. This is the guy tasked with overseeing the delinquents in the show. Turning BB's child gun into meteorites, symbol of a funded foreign op that in this context is very dangerous. Also has the power to see anyone's thoughts through his phone. Symbol of surveillance. One last thing. A fight in this show where the only way to breathe is wearing a Russian hat and doing a dance. A symbol of foreign communication necessity to continue a battle. Banks and war. Here's a cultural push I dug up today that will bring some clarity to the comms systems there. September 2, 1945. World War II ends Japan. April 22, 1946. Seizi-san first published. Manga that became the longest-running animated series and embodied the modern Japanese family post-World War II. Notably it waged war on cultural norms of the day by not only being authored by a woman, but a woman pushing a strong female role model that dominated the men around her. This was exactly 1 year before the U.S. drafted Constitution gave women the right to vote. Meaning this was a calculated push on the culture to change views. The sudden rise of a female-penned female-starred pro-feminist manga is no accident. So who in Japan was tasked with this push? January 30, 1920. Seizi-san, author born. January 30, 1920. Mazda Motor Corporation founded. Mazda, like most of the rest of the big companies there, had become part of the government in World War II, and they resumed operations producing drills in 1946, same time as Seizi-san. Drill's symbolism equals drilling ideas into a brain. Often used in MK comms, but this is a positive. You can now understand the cultural pushes going on all around us, and not all are objectively evil. It does beg the question of why there is so much focus on creating countless divisions. But that's a subject for another post. This post is about Goldman Sachs, and the biggest modern scandal tied to them is their profits tied to the 2008 market collapse. Specifically, the government bailed out AIG, and AIG paid $12.9 billion of the bailout to Goldman Sachs. To understand better, I'll decode AIG. December 19, 1919, finance and insurance company AIG, American International Group established by Vander Star. December 19, 1919, American Meteorological Society established in Boston. December 19, 1919, comic strip that would become Popeye debut, Navy sailor traveling the world. Star tracking. There are 2 dates given for the Meteorological Society. One 10 days later on the wiki. Either way, it's clearly connected. January 21, 1920, American Meteorological Society Incorporated. January 21, 1920, First League of Nations meeting ends with 5 international peace treaties. AIG founded by Star, and the point of a meteorological society is to follow stars. Symbol of tracking the newly global ops AIG funds and disseminating the information among comms-aware scientific community. Fits my decoding perfectly. June 21, 2020. Asteroid the size of Eiffel Tower in France headed towards Earth this week. June 21, 2020. Maxwell reported as hiding in France. Which is all just to say the massive bank known as the American International Group, setting up station in China in 1919, required a way to publicly release updates about progress. The Meteorological Society does exactly that. The general populace notices nothing. Note the League of Nations logo is also a star. None of this gives us whether what they did was positive or negative. I can often decode the general subject, but ascertaining intent requires a lot more digging and critical thinking. It's official history that the burdens and humiliation forced on Germany through this League of Nations was the start of World War II. It can be reasonably concluded the intent for a future war was built into the solution, ending WW1. Bullying a destroyed country into psychosis. Goldman Sachs has a connection to World War I in that the original 2 families, Goldman and Sachs, split up in World War I as they chose different sides in the war. In that documentary from Goldman, it asserted this was a permanent break between families. The split was specifically in rejecting joining hands with J.P. Morgan in financing the Allies in World War I. J.P. Morgan had just helped create the Federal Reserve through Titanic. By its very nature, it allowed the U.S. to move money for global wars. Titanic decode. There is nothing that costs more than wars, and as such one can't help but be suspicious of motivations in funding wars. It's good to say we should fund the end of Nazis committing holocausts, but if the creation of those Nazis was part of that same plan, what then? It makes the Nazis the brainwashed puppets of the very people fighting them. It clarifies the blame can be traced to the families intentionally cultivating war for profit. The nature of this manipulation is hidden behind comms, and that's a big reason disclosure is fought. 1914 equals WW1. What led up to it? And what was intended after? 1913, when Hitler, Trotsky, Tito, Freud, Stalin all lived within walking distance of the King Emperor of Austria-Hungary. Joseph Stalin, future ruler of the USSR. Adolf Hitler, future ruler of Germany. Franz Ferdinand, Death sets off WW1. A century ago, a single square mile in the capital of the then Austro-Hungarian Empire was home to some of the most remarkable men of the 20th century. The future leaders of USSR/Germany together. It likely represented the planning stages for who gets to be in control of what post-WW1. Also in walking distance. Trotsky, the man who reinvented Marxism. Sigmund Freud, most famous psychiatrist to ever live. Mass psych push. This psych push was strongly tied to medicating the populace. Sigmund Freud led the charge in Germany to give the populace this new, magical, wonder drug called cocaine. The company Merck was the patent holder with a monopoly on it for some time. Name sound familiar? Reminds me of Merkel, the long-lasting German leader of the EU. This could be coincidence, of course, but I bring Merck up mostly because it will bring us full circle back to Goldman Sachs. Merck was the company that put Goldman Sachs back on the map post-World War II. They handled the IPO months after WW1 ended. The first big one. Merck transferred their stock to the federal government as a sign of goodwill, which then was given through Goldman Sachs to make public. They took it public in partnership with Lehman Brothers. Lehman being the largest company to bust during the 2008 financial crisis, attributed by some to Goldman Sachs. Especially the policies that began in Clinton administration for housing, handled by Goldman Sachs. Lehman Brothers collapsed 1 month before the bailout that Goldman Sachs benefited greatly from. September 12, 2008. Lehman Brothers collapsed, the largest bankruptcy of all time. October 3, 2008. Bank bailout. Lehman Brothers was the 4th biggest bank in the world. It almost seems like the crisis was intended to remove a competitor. But there's little way to be sure of that. What is clear is just before the Lehman collapse, the president of Lehman Brothers was removed from the New York Federal Reserve Board. The official cause of the crisis was the massive number of mortgages taken. There is dispute as to why this occurred, but it's hard to ignore the rules that facilitated this were put in place by Goldman Sachs under Clinton. It's difficult to guess modern motivations, but the events leading to World War II clearly tied into the cocaine push. Goldman Sachs became longtime allies tied to Merck, which had a monopoly on the stuff. The media push of Freud suggests media assets as well. That alongside their work with partnering with J.P. Morgan ties them to central banks/Rothschild during that time. The company most connected to cocaine as a symbol is Coke. 1668 Merck founded Germany. 1886 Coca-Cola launched, cocaine plus Coca leaves. 1891 Merck USA founded. There are few products that can compare to Coca-Cola with the push for mass consumption. March 12, 1894, Coca-Cola sold in bottles for the first time. March 17, 1894. First Stanley Cup playoff game occurs. Stanley symbolism tied to creating or tracking psychos. July 4, 1909, Stanley Hotel/Overlook Hotel opened. July 4, 1909, Me 6 founded Five Eyes. Goldman Sachs nicknamed Government Sachs due to how many had high positions in government. Began with FDR, most newsworthy with Clinton due to crisis, but also during Bush, Obama, and Trump. Steve Bannon was Goldman Sachs an advisor behind Seinfeld. It's tough to say the precise motivation of Goldman Sachs throughout all those administrations, and even tougher to say to what degree it changed. Even so, it is clear they were more fans of Hillary and Bill Clinton. Despite having members in the cabinet, it's also clear the company itself was not a fan of Trump at certain points in time. The former CEO of Goldman Sachs tweeted for the first time ever to express outrage at Trump pulling out of the climate accords. Former Q made special note that the Goldman Sachs CEO stepping down was not his choice. This follows a pattern with many big companies when they flip, and we can derive quite a bit more on intentions due to the curious Paris Accords disagreement. April 22, 2016, Paris Accords global agreement to lower emissions. April 22, 2016, Ghislaine Maxwell deposition about Epstein. I suspect Paris Accords represented a global agreement not to use long-collected blackmail as leverage to remove heads of business and force changes. The very thing Trump did. This explains both how the CEO of Goldman Sachs could be removed as well as countless others we've seen over the years. This is also why the waves of usage are tied to heat increasing. Ongoing and with record length. High temperatures have already scorched the Southwest this month, and more heat is expected in the Midwest and the Northeast in the coming days. It also means the comms tied to replacing Goldman Sachs CEO are probably worth looking into. Not the only big CEO change that day either. October 1, 2018, David Solomon replaces Lloyd Blankfield, Goldman Sachs CEO. October 1, 2018, GE removes Flannery as CEO. Solomon. Probably coincidence, but Solomon is a conservative writer and Trump ally. Not the same one, of course, but it is possible using the same name is meant to imply affiliation. I'm also reminded of coronavirus hitting Solomon Islands and comms being more vocal in the news scene than other larger countries it hit. Given coronavirus was a flipping op, it's possible they used it to send comms about Goldman Sachs related cleanup. Though this is very much a hypothesis with no verification, yet. I hadn't understood the significance of Trump breaking Paris Accord until now, but remember that early Q. November 1, 2017, Q. We all have the goods on everyone else. June 1, 2017, Trump announces withdrawal from Paris Accords. May 20, 2017, Trump's Saudi dance. This flip helps clarify some of the bigger financial pushes that would likely need a Goldman Sachs to achieve. AMC and GameStop. Most recently. July 25, 2023, Goldman Sachs raises AMC Entertainment's price target to $175. AMC and GameStop. I think I get it. Goldman Sachs raises AMC Entertainment's price target to $175. The Goldman Sachs Group increases AMC Entertainment price target to $175. The push to the moon for AMC and GameStop is something I've been asked frequently about. AMC equals the largest theater chain. GameStop equals the largest game retailer chain. Both represent large blocks of business tied not to a specific movie or game company, but something shared across many. They both uniquely were nearly killed by coronavirus but were saved by the pump as both had stocks that exploded despite both have dead business due to COVID. The point, especially with Elon Musk tied into it, has at least two purposes I can discern. The first of which is using these specific stocks to pump represent supporting movie and game market. This is something appreciated by larger ops groups tied to movies and games. A promise they are on the same side, not trying to destroy markets but clean up. The other purpose and actual point of pumping in money is that the newly far wealthier owners on receiving end sell and use part of it to fund ops. Notice BlackRock being the one to make money here. BlackRock recently replaced Goldman Sachs. March 24, 2020, Fed taps BlackRock to purchase bonds. Fed takeover was tied to BlackRock as well. Goldman's top flipped, but flipping means walking on a tightrope in hostile territory to avoid reprisal. New talent can push harder. Big departures newly reported at Goldman Sachs. Q highlighted many examples of people newly leaving or entering powerful institutions as good. It's the definition of cleaning an institution. It could go the other direction, but the pattern has been positive, and I doubt that is changing now. Anyway, this thread I think is educational in putting together the big picture for any long-time readers of mine, and I mostly only dug into one big bank. There are others that may be even more important. Citi's Al-Waleed and Trump. Like for example Citigroup. Goldman Sachs/Clinton Treasury Chair at the top of Citi in 2007, the guy whose policies created the 2007 housing subprime mortgage crisis. February 22, 1991. Saudi Prince Al-Waleed to become Citicorp's top stockholder. Notice Federal Reserve urged Citi to do this. This was a week before Gulf War ends. given this war involved Saudi Arabia. Newspaper had Iraq accepting pull-out truce juxtaposed with Bush rejecting it. I also noticed this was the same year Trump sold that famous Saudi Arabian yacht from Adnan Khashoggi. So July 11, 1991, Trump says he sold it a couple of weeks ago. Let's do the math. July 11, 1991. 14 days equals June 27, 1991. July 27, 1991. Slovenia Independence War. Why is that surprising? Hint, notice it mentions his new engagement to Marla Maples. Surely you know who came after Marla Maples. The only famous Slovenian in the world, Melania Trump. A person who the news focuses on her background in Slovenia for reasons I never understood. They were engaged in 2004, which is when Slovenia joined the EU. Let's go through the basics. Trump marries Czechoslovakian Ivana, April 7, 1977, and the two become a famous power couple in New York, constantly featured in articles. As in used for comms. What comms? Czech equals Soviet satellite state. Trump and Ivana divorce 1990 with a non-disclosure agreement the same year the Czech adopt an independent constitution. Effectively a divorce from the former Soviet sphere. I'm not necessarily asserting one is a comm for the other yet. I'm still parsing the information. The relationship was clearly a comms vehicle across decades. Right after the divorce, Ivana appears in a penthouse with a focus on Jimmy Hoffa ordering JFK's murder. Instead of solving that, let's return to Al-Waleed. He purchased the famous yacht in 1991, same year he became top of Citi 1991. This was due to the Federal Reserve urging them to get more money, which forces them into a relationship with Al-Waleed. Runs at 17/Q knots and famous for being in a James Bond movie and representing ultimate wealth. What can be done when money is of no consequence? It began a trend with the ultra-wealthy. Remember, the Federal Reserve urged Citi to take on Al-Waleed. That connection between the Fed and Citi is an interesting one when we reconcile later events. Al-Waleed funded Obama and his bank. Citi picked his cabinet, as proven by WikiLeaks. After Trump became friends with Saudi Arabia, Al-Waleed was arrested. Why was he released? February 5, 2018. Trump's pick for the Federal Reserve assumes office. February 5, 2018. Q. Dopey freed. Dopey being what Trump called Al-Waleed. This isn't the date he was freed, but Q connects the two events for reasons that'll become clear shortly. We have a new top of the Fed right as Al-Waleed was freed. Also, Barr, the next position in the Fed board. Reminds me of a certain attorney general, but that is best viewed as coincidence until additional patterns clarify. The actual day of release, we have a post specifically pointing to the newly freed with the phrase, "Time to play." This and other posts suggest the release was a flip in exchange for the materials accrued. Who controls the White House? Moreover, the other posts that day likely give examples on the kinds of things accrued. Not just lewd. And the other post about freeing the good people who had been blackmailed, threatened and enslaved, that's a perfect description if my hypothesis is correct. Given Q connects the Waleed release to the Fed change, it can be assumed strings for the U.S. Central Bank ran through him. Same day of the change, Rothschild fire sale. Let's return to the start. Did you notice that bit at the bottom? Notice he died in 2022. Who else died around that time? The old guard for almost a century. Looks like the times just changed. September 8, 2022. Queen Elizabeth death. Plus 60 days. November 7, 2022. Evelyn de Rothschild banking heir and advisor to the Queen death. If there were any Q post I wish had an asterisk, it would be that one with, "There are no coincidences," because there are actual coincidences, and you can drive yourself insane if you don't recognize the difference, but those are not coincidences. Those two were not regular celebrities. Do you have any idea how many countries are still under the crown? Do you recognize what the patriarch of central banks represents? Especially given one spoke for the other, and for them to die 60 days apart like that is not coincidence. Neither are these. February 22, 2021. Prince Philip fake obituary printed. This was highly reported on the 24th. February 24, 2021. Head of Queen Elizabeth missing, Prince Philip. January 20, 2019. Epstein's 66th birthday. Plus 202 days. August 10, 2019. Epstein death at age 66 and 6 months old. Plus 303 days. April 9, 2021. Prince Philip dead at 99 on 99th day. No coincidences is an important mindset to have and employ, to recognize these little telltale signs of planning in messaging. There are coincidences, but the world is full of people who leave a breadcrumb trail through history like this. A way to speak to those who know how to listen. It's magic, it's everything meaningful that hides in plain sight. And this is why we study. Because that's the only way we are going to have a prayer of knowing what's going on anywhere. I do wonder how many great things would come if the best in the world instead of comms spent that time on inventing or productively philosophizing with the masses. I bet it would at least lead to happier marriages. I understand there is probably a reluctance to bring it to the public, but the more I learn, the more certain I am it needs to happen. Unless you luck out and are born with connections to people willing to teach, you are forced to traverse a world of nonsense and distort it into whatever is deemed appropriate for the masses. Whatever is convenient for the powerful. Nothing meaningful is questioned, and every strange thing is said to be coincidence. Okay. I've veered off topic, and yet it's kind of relevant for all topics. Regardless, I will definitely be decoding more banks in the future, but I've been trying to make smaller and more frequent posts due to feedback, so I'm choosing to stop here, for now. So which bank should I next decode? Course I'll be taking a few subjects in between. Looking at the list. I do see a pattern in relation to size. I suppose if there was one place I haven't covered enough, it's China. Though in recent news Africa is the hottest topic. Something I go into in this thread. A million topics I could decode, and it's always a tough choice. This is why I value our Telegram, as decoding suggestions makes this whole thing I do more like a public service. Smiley face. Telegram chat. Join the Decoding Telegram group. This has been Globalism Banking, Gold for Sachs.